It's an increasingly uncertain world. What's the future of Australia's place in it? AUKUS? Trump? China? Security in our region and around the world is in doubt, and the major parties say they're best placed to deliver stability. So what do the experts and the big thinkers say? Should we consider new friends, new allies, new trade deals, and new weapons to defend our country? On ABC Radio across Australia and on the ABC News Channel, helping you to make an informed choice on election day. This is Your Say, Future Australia. Your host, Hamish Mcdonald.
Well, a very warm welcome to you. Throughout this federal election campaign, we've been hearing about the issues that matter most to you. Tens of thousands of Australians have submitted responses as part of the Your Say project. We've heard a lot about housing, energy, the cost of living crisis as well, but turning up in the top three issues for voters, Australia's place in the world, our relationship with America, with China, and of course the thorny issue of those expensive nuclear-powered submarines. So when you cast your vote, will you know where the major parties stand on these issues? In this hour, we're going to unpack, explore, even debate what exactly is on offer. My name's Hamish Mcdonald and welcome to Your Say, Future Australia. We're live right across the country on ABC Radio and on the television as well. If you're watching or listening, we'd love you to get involved. The number to connect with us on is 1300 222 702. You can ring us right now, in fact, and here to answer your questions, the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. Very good afternoon.
Good to see you.
Also, Hayley Channer, the Director of Economic Security at the United States Studies Centre. Good afternoon to you.
Hamish.
Dr. Lavina Lee, a Senior Academic and Policy Advisor from Macquarie Uni with deep insights into Australia's strategic choices in the Asia-Pacific. Hello.
Hello.
And Mike Pezzulo, the former Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs with decades of experience in defence, intelligence and, of course, border security. Good afternoon to you.
Hamish.
From around Australia, your questions, your priorities and your views. Our first question comes from Susan in Melbourne. What's your question, Susan?
Thank you, Hamish, and hello to all. With the current changes in the US administration and emanating mixed messaging, especially in relation to the AUKUS defence policy, I believe and would encourage a more prudent approach for Australia to revisit the French naval group Suffren-class submarines to be built in Australia. This would provide future defence certainty for our country with a more reasonable timeframe. Mike, do you agree?
Mike Pezzulo.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thanks for the question. Respectfully, I don't. I think we should stay the course, but I think we need a number of fallback and parallel plans to deal with the uncertainty that your question speaks to. I think there's been, frankly, too many changes made. I think we have to be realistic, and other panellists have got strong views on this as well as I do. We have to be realistic about the chances of getting a Virginia class off the American production line, so we need to deal with that. We need to be very hard-nosed with our British partners about the design of the AUKUS submarine as well. And then we need some alternative options that are not necessarily underwater options to achieve the same mission effects in case there is, in fact, a capability gap. And very finally, we must get some clarity, and Mr Miles has spoken about this during the campaign in passing, or just slightly through the campaign. Can we actually break open the current Collins class, which needs to be done, the engines repaired
There's
and the
the
batteries?
existing ones we have.
Correct. So those are the four issues that I think all need close study, and then you can make a decision.
But to be specific, that was a question about the French option, yes. Reopening it and re-beginning those talks.
I would not be in favour of that. It's just too much churn in our policy. I'd do those other four things.
Hayley?
And Hamish, can I add to that as well? Yeah, I mean, if you think about AUKUS, it's a multi-decadal project. It's had less than 4 years to go. So we really don't have enough data to say, oh, let's get rid of it and go to something else again. I also think that there's not enough attention on the reputational damage of Australia of changing again, particularly when we see progress with AUKUS in terms of US Congress approving the sale of Virginia-class submarines. You've got Australian shipbuilders training overseas, whether it's the US or UK. So I think we need a longer lead time, and obviously we should be always evaluating it, but AUKUS needs to be thought of more like a whole-of-nation building project rather than a defence project. I mean, AUKUS is often seen through the lens of US and submarines. It's actually meant to be much, much broader than that. It's meant to be building Australia's defence industry base, building our workforce, upskilling us. It's basically a multifaceted approach, but it's being treated more like a defence project. So I think it needs more time to actually see how it can be a success.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, look, I didn't drink the Kool-Aid, OK, so I'm sorry about that, but I think AUKUS is in serious, serious trouble. I think it is more likely than not that we will not get any submarines from the Americans.
Why is that?
Well, for the very simple reason that the legislation that Hayley was talking about as being a great achievement specifically says that no submarine can be transferred to Australia unless the President certifies 270 days beforehand that the transfer would not degrade the underwater capabilities of the US Navy and that their own shipbuilding industry has the capacity to meet the US Navy's requirements and ours. Now, it is common ground that they need to be building at least 2 of these Virginia-class submarines a year to meet their own needs. They are currently building 1.1 per annum. As of March the 11th this year.
This detail gets talked about a lot in sort of foreign policy circles and defence circles. You're talking to people making up their minds about how to vote today. The problem we've got at the moment is that both sides of politics are in denial. It is bipartisan gaslighting, and there is a pretense that nothing is going on. There is no plan B. Mike quite rightly said there has to be a plan what do we do if we don't get any submarines? You see, the problem we've got with the AUKUS deal, it is so unfair to Australia. I mean, it is a terrible deal. People say, will Donald Trump love it? Donald Trump will think it's fantastic, and he'll think, gosh, where can I do any more deals with these idiots? They seem to have lots of money and no brains. I mean, we are giving the Americans $3 billion to support their shipbuilding industry. That would pay for most of one Virginia-class submarine, but there's no guarantee of any subs, and they don't have to sell us any subs unless they conclude that their Navy doesn't need them. And their Navy is currently about 20 subs short of what they say they need, and they're producing about half as many as they need to replace the ones that are retiring. So what chance have we got of them putting us ahead of them? And when you raise this with people, and there's this kind of Kool-Aid thing going on with AUKUS, you know, it was at that forum I had in Canberra recently that Hayley and Mike were there, and it's there available, internet and podcast and so forth. You know, you had people defending AUKUS saying the same kind of thing. Oh, it's a whole-of-nation exercise, and we've got to... And Dennis Richardson actually said to me, Malcolm, it's very unhelpful for you to be persistently asking these difficult questions. Well, I'm sorry. I think it's important that Australians do ask difficult questions, and that is to say to both the government and the opposition who wants to be the government, what is your plan if, as is more likely than not, we end up with no submarines at all? And this great submarine project ends up with 0 subs, and we need to have a plan. Lavina?
And I think the French subs is one. Just to answer the question, French subs would be one, but I think it'd be very hard to execute. But as Mike, I think that would be the ideal plan, but execution difficulty probably 11 out of 10. But I think the other alternatives are ones that involve no submarines.
Lavina?
I think it's just too early to be panicking about this. There's nothing that I've seen.
Did you think Malcolm's panicking?
No, I don't mean... OK. No, I don't think panicking. I don't think panicking. But I just mean that there's nothing that the Trump administration has actually said to suggest that they're not committed to the AUKUS agreement. So far, I think, say, for example, when we've been talking about submarines, the first time the issue of Australia developing new submarines came up in around 2008, 2009. So going back to what Hayley said earlier, we don't want to start the clock again from now. And I think we can't forget that this is actually quite an extraordinary agreement. There's really, literally only one other country in the whole world who's been offered this kind of access to technology. And as Hayley said as well, it's more than just the nuclear submarines. It is also AUKUS Pillar 2, which we don't talk about, or perhaps the public is not as aware of.
There's not a lot to talk about.
Well, there could be.
There's not much happening.
We have agency, is what I'm saying.
But there's not much happening.
So what I'm saying is that the Trump administration is very clear that those allies that invest in their defence, who are committed to building capability, are valued, highly valued. And I think we can be assured, I feel, that the United States has shown that it is prioritising the Indo-Pacific and that it is here to compete in the region.
Across Australia, you're listening on ABC Radio and perhaps watching as well on ABC Television. You can get in touch. You can ask a question. 1300 222 702 is the number. To the point, though, Mike Pezzulo, about whether or not the Trump administration has said anything that might make us doubt it. They have made noises about us increasing our defence spending up to about 3% of GDP. I mean, we might find ourselves in a position where we don't get what we thought we were paying for if they suddenly change their tune. Just because Trump hasn't said something doesn't mean he won't, right?
I think there is a timing issue. I agree with Lavina. We shouldn't panic, but we should nonetheless act expeditiously. I think there is a timing imperative to start putting in place some lateral, I don't mean substitute, but lateral policies in place which can go forward simultaneously, 3 or 4 tracks. And just to really do a footnote on the previous conversation and then jump to defence spending, Malcolm's absolutely right. The CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations, the head of the American Navy, has to certify in a public document, this is publicly available, that the combat force that they need of submarines is in the mid-60s, about 66. They're currently deploying 41. So there is that gap that Malcolm speaks of. No US president will lightly, either from a strategic point of view, a military point of view, or indeed a political point of view, say, oh, that gap's okay, we'll give the Aussies one. So I think one of the major items in the in tray of the new Prime Minister and the government, it doesn't matter which side it is to lock down some kind of agreement that says you're putting 4 of those submarines. Just think about this. They're putting 4 of their submarines, 10% of their force, into Perth from 2027. They're not going there just to train Australian sailors. That is a combat location for the Americans to operate from. That's 10% of their fleet. Is there something that we can do without getting into the maze of possibilities here around sustainment and maintenance? Is there something that we can do that allows them to sweat their assets more efficiently so they get more boats back out into the water? That's one track. I think an American president, whether it's President Trump or, to Malcolm's point, probably the next president, whoever that might be, they will have to certify, in the terms that Malcolm spoke of, that selling one to the Australians is not to the detriment of the US Navy. I think we can do a deal about sweating their assets more. However, and this is the however point, I think we have to be grown up and accept that the location of those submarines in Perth is a dramatic change in our alliance. Yeah. It's a combat force, it is not a training force. Right,
we are going to get to some more of your calls. Apparently we're being flooded with calls at the moment on this topic of AUKUS. We will try and get to some of them. 1300 222 702 is the number. Do you want to just respond to everything that's being said here, Malcolm? Because, I mean, the assertion about panic has been made. Are you being a bit flighty about this?
No, I mean, look, we are due, the President will have to make a decision to sell us a Virginia-class submarine in 2031, which is, 6 years away. That is not a very long time in defence terms, particularly when you're talking about big projects. They, as I said, Mike's acknowledged, they're currently more than 20 submarines short of what they say they need, and most importantly, they're building currently about half as many as they need to meet their own requirements.
Sure.
So the point
why
is,
not try and make it work rather than sort of back out?
Well, no, I'm not saying we should back out. I'm just saying my point is that this is the problem. Everyone talks over the top of each other. I'm not saying pull out of AUKUS. What I'm saying is that we have to recognise there is a very real prospect that we will not get any Virginia-class submarines, which will mean that because our existing fleet of Collins-class submarines will retire, we could be faced with a decade or more, maybe 15, possibly 20 years, of having no submarines at all. Now, this possibility is being widely canvassed in Washington, and it is canvassed in congressional documents and reports. And what they suggest is, in those circumstances, maybe it'd be smarter for Australia to let the Americans do the submarining and instead spend money on other long-range strike capabilities that, would be long-range bombers and missiles. So, but the point is, see, we're in this situation where we've got a plan A that is very likely not to be achieved. But no one's prepared to admit that, because it's like saying the emperor has no clothes, and so we have no plan B. And so if we wait, as Lavina was suggesting, and we wait till 2031 and the American president makes the inevitable decision, we then go, oh gosh, what a surprise, we've got nothing. So we don't have a plan A and we don't have a plan B. And I just think this is irresponsible and reckless.
All right, let's take a caller. Alan in Adelaide is listening on ABC Radio. What's your question, Alan?
G'day, Hamish. My question is, should we fast-track the development and manufacture of our own drone submarines in Australia?
Hayley, do you want to take that one?
Well, part of the second pillar of AUKUS is advanced capabilities. It includes things like autonomy, undersea capabilities, but also artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cyber, basically the cutting-edge technology of the future, which we'll be sharing and co-developing with the US and the UK. I think it's really important we don't forget the middle part of AUKUS, which is the UK part. In terms of undersea drones, this is a question that comes up a lot, actually, with my friends and colleagues. Why don't you just use unmanned systems? Why we need submarines?
But also the head of the submarine agency says, doesn't he, that the AUKUS submarines will be developed, the AUKUS-class submarines would be capable of deploying things like drone submarines.
That's right. I think what's important to remember is that we can't rely simply on drones because the technology isn't there yet. We know the submarine technology is there. That's proven technology. But also, every country, every developed country in the Indo-Pacific is investing in submarines. And the best counter to a submarine is a submarine. So Australia does need something to replace the Collins class. I think very last point is to that point I mentioned before about the UK. This is not just a bilateral Australia-US deal. It doesn't just ride on the US. The SSN AUKUS is meant to replace not only the Australian Collins class, it's meant to replace the UK's Astute class. So there's a lot tied up into this agreement and there's a lot hanging on it. And I think all three countries, the reasons...
possibly the Virginia as well, possibly.
Yeah. The reason they came together in the first place, those fundamental reasons still exist to underpin this deal.
We haven't really mentioned the money. In total, this could cost up to almost 370 billion. That's the sort of forecast, Lavina. As Australians are weighing all of the policy choices in front of them, housing, cost of living, energy transition, can you make the argument as to why that much money should be spent on something that, as Malcolm Turnbull puts, there's no guarantee we'll get?
Look, I think one thing that's been really missing from this election debate, I think a lot of us on this table would agree, is that there's not enough frank conversations about the actual seriousness of the strategic competition that's going on around us and the risk of conflict in the region, and it's sooner rather than later.
But I hear from people that are listening right now every single day saying, why won't they name the threat? Now, Peter Dutton did in one of the debates. He said it's China. Is that part of the problem, that our leaders just won't verbalise what it is that we might be facing?
I think so far the election has really been prosecuted on domestic issues. And it really could have been much more of an election focused on defence and security matters, because it is as though we're putting our heads in the sand and forgetting that the world is around us, and we're prosecuting things that are really small beer, like $1,200 in tax rebates as an election pitch.
But if you're struggling with weekly or monthly bills, that's not a small thing, right?
That's important.
It's important, but I think if we look forward in 5-10 years' time, people will be looking back at this election and judging our political leaders and both sides of politics for not making this more of an issue.
Okay.
I mean, I do a lot of work on nuclear deterrence. I've been around the region. I've just been in Hawaii, South Korea and Japan. They're all seriously thinking about China's nuclear modernisation and the fact that within 10 years' time, China is predicted to reach nuclear parity. So that has real significant implications for the prospect that China might actually be tempted to use conventional forces in our region. So we might be, yes, focused on cost of living, but all of these strategic risks of conflict are increasing in our region.
Can I just make one point? I mean, China, I'm not suggesting that. Look at the threat. I mean, the threat is a combination of capability and intent, right? China is developing the capability that would enable us to, seriously challenge our independence and sovereignty. they have not manifested the intent. But, as the saying goes, capability takes a long time to put in place. Intent can change in a heartbeat. Yes. Having said that, we cannot... I think Trump, in a way, is irrelevant to AUKUS because I think the problem about the availability of the Virginias is would be an issue for any American president, whether they were, the most friendly to Australia imaginable. But let's just think about this. Donald Trump has used economic coercion against Canada and repeatedly said he believes it should be the 51st state, right? He has said that he will get Greenland, a territory of Denmark, whatever it takes. He'll get it one way or the other. It's exactly what he said to the Congress, right? He said he will seize the Panama Canal, OK? Now, can you imagine what we would all be saying if Xi Jinping said Vietnam should be a province of China? All right? If he did that,
there'd be a reaction.
People would say this is terrible, so forth, etc., etc. So the problem we've got, the fundamental problem we have with Trump is that his values are aligned with those of Vladimir Putin. He believes might is right. And yet for 80 years, the Pax Americana, the international rules-based order, all of that stuff that we've all been signed up to and believe in since the Second World War, has been designed to ensure that might is not right and that the strong cannot do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. But Trump is not, that's not his agenda, and he doesn't make any bones about it.
We've got lots of calls on that as well. We're going to get to Ron in a moment in Victoria. But I just want your thoughts on this before we move on, because we are coming to the Trump bit of the conversation and the moment. There's an image that I'd like you to take a look at if you're listening on radio across Australia. It's this incredible image of Trump and Zelensky meeting inside the Vatican as they both attended the Pope's funeral at the weekend. Yep. Such an extraordinary image because it's so different to the meeting in the White House not so long ago. Whoever is Prime Minister of Australia after this weekend, Peter Dutton or Anthony Albanese, the likely choices anyway, unless something goes well beyond what the polls predict, they'll have to meet with Trump. And we all know that some creative responses are involved. So very briefly, your creative, uniquely Australian thoughts on who we should send, what we could do, do we have to gift something or do we take the tough man approach? Obviously, I think Greg Norman's been sent in the past, but...
No, he was not sent in the past. Look, this is just... What do you say? Look, get off your knees, Hamish. I mean, seriously, as the Australian Prime Minister should go to Washington and stand up for Australia. I mean, it makes me want to vomit.
I disagree
the way
with that.
all of the sycophants... Oh, you do? Well, look,
I think that actually Australia should be using
the disadvantage of actually knowing what
benefits,
it is to deal with Trump.
But the truth is that we actually do have skill sets and people that we can use to manipulate Trump towards Australia's interests. And we should use all the tools in the toolbox to do that so that we get what we need.
Okay.
He's a transactional president. And, I mean, we do G'day USA and we send all of our movie stars over there. It's soft power. It's something that the US used to have. It doesn't have anymore. But Australia should definitely use soft power. And to Hamish, to your question, you know, normally I would say Australians should use humour. That's our natural advantage. We should be the larrikins. But I actually don't think that's the way to go with President Trump. I do think ingratiating ourselves, making him feel good, unannounceable is really important. If you think about the way that the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, tried to evade the tariffs, it was all about packaging up a deal, and Trump looked through what was on offer, and all he could remember was, oh, Australia buys lots of airplanes from America because Australia is so far away from everything else, and he found that quite a novelty. We need to find a PR package that he can repeat, and in that occasion, it didn't work. We still were tariffed. But if we use something like critical minerals, for instance, and we do something that looks attractive to him, we can use our soft power and our natural resources to actually get something out of the next 4 years.
Why do you object to this so strongly?
Well, I just because I actually know how to deal with Donald Trump. I've dealt with Donald Trump. I stood up to Donald Trump. I won his respect and I got a very good outcome from him. I won exemptions on steel and aluminium. I got him to stick to a refugee deal he hated. And I didn't do that by sucking up to him.
Don't you think he's a different president this time around?
Well, look, he's the same man, right? And he's the same personality. And I'm just saying to you that there has been a conga line of sycophants and lobbyists and grifters going and, you know, advisors saying, oh, you've got to flatter Trump, suck up to him. And all they end up getting is more bullying, right? Now, I'm not saying you've got to go and punch him in the nose or have a fight with him, but you have to, if you're going to deal with the bully, and I have dealt with many bullies and I've dealt with Trump successfully, more successfully, I would say, than any other leader at the time. You know, think of another...
But what about our relationship with China, for instance? We don't go and punch China in the face all the time.
No, we don't. Of course, I'm not suggesting we punch Trump in the face. I'm saying to you that all I'm saying is, and you know, this is informed by my own experience as an Australian Prime Minister dealing with him, is that the way to succeed with the United States is to stand up for our position, and rather than going there with trinkets and gifts, say, listen, we provide you, you have a... This is what I did. I said, you have a great trade relationship with us. You have no tariffs, no quotas and a big surplus. You can't get a better trade deal. I said, I pointed out what we delivered to America in terms of our defence partnership, you know, particularly our geography. You know, this, I mean, we deliver real value to the Americans in our relationship. But if we go in on our knees, and I mean, honestly, I just say I've said this to Australian leaders, and I just say this to Australians, have enough pride in yourself, believe in yourself. Look at what the Canadians did. Is Mark Carney on his knees? Are the Canadians on their knees? You know what their motto is? Elbows up, which basically means a bit of biffo in ice hockey. So, you know, when you're dealing with a bully, you've got to stand up to him. And I'm just really disappointed with this approach that we should go there bearing gifts.
I see it more as a business deal rather than going on our knees. It's what we can offer them in a more transactional way.
Yeah,
I think it's just being realistic. I mean, all alliances are always transactional. So our alliance, yes, it's 70 years old and it's built on more than just transactional feelings. But the current administration, all allies of the United States are going in there, not on their knees. I do think we do need to emphasise what we provide, what we give. Our geography is extremely important, and to put that forward as a list of things that we contribute. But I think Trump is very much about allies who help themselves and can help the United States.
All right, let's take another caller. 1300 222 702 is the number. You're listening on ABC Radio across Australia. You can text us as well if you want using the ABC Listen app. And if you're watching on television, please do give us a ring. Let's take a call from Ron in Victoria. What's your question, Ron? Thanks for waiting on the line.
Hello, Hamish and panel. Thanks for taking my question, and it's for Mike Pezzulo. In the past, Australia has always supported the USA in defence proposals and initiatives. My question is, in view of the dramatic change in US politics, should we have a more substantial defence relationship with Europe, New Zealand, Indonesia and Japan instead?
Thanks, Ron. The short answer is yes, we should do that anyway, but there are some unique qualities to our alliance, which... and this touches on the discussion we just had, for all of the emotion around mateship and all the rest of it, it's actually based on very material factors. John Curtin was told by Douglas MacArthur very bluntly, whether you were Dutch, French, Portuguese or Spanish in 1941-42, we have to be here. The strategic geography, if you look at the sort of projection of the globe that Australia provides to protect the southern approaches into the Pacific and then into America, is absolutely critical. So to Hayley's point about packaging the deal, and Malcolm touched on this, strategic geography is vitally important. There are elements of that have been touched on, particularly after Hawke declassified with Reagan's agreement certain functions that are performed in Australia that in their depth cannot really be talked about. Malcolm knows about them because he was Prime Minister and I used to manage the area. But there are some critical functions we provide from our geography that literally keeps America safe.
This is things like Pine Gap, for example?
There is a particular function, one of which I can talk about because it was disclosed by the Reagan and Hawke administrations in the 1980s. We provide a unique geostrategic place in the world that stares at the Eurasian landmass, and Lavina talked earlier about the parity that the Chinese will ultimately have with the Americans on their nuclear warheads. They're moving to 1,500 warheads. The Russians already have 1,500. The Americans are treaty limited to 1,500. The only way an American president gets given a warning that you've got 28 minutes before these start to splash down in America is because an Aussie down in Alice Springs will see those flashes.
So just explain this to me, because part of the debate in Australia in relation to the tariffs and Trump is why not use some of our security arrangements with the United States as leverage if we have to argue against tariffs?
There's positive leverage in life, so we should build on that to say this is all the stuff we do with you, and we can do other things around critical minerals and all sorts of things. Malcolm's right on one thing. I just want to quickly weigh in on that. I was there the day after Malcolm took the phone call and had the phone call on the refugees. Dutton was my minister, I was the Secretary of the Department. We had to back in the head of government call. The message came down, get onto Homeland Security straight away and lock in the deal. They were not happy, but they were impressed by the fact that Australia was standing up to them. So Malcolm's absolutely right. You can do lots of things with cultural diplomacy and soft diplomacy, but in the end, power, it's a hierarchical concept. It flows from the top.
Lavina, though, this was a question about whether we've got other options.
Yep.
Could we play the field a bit more in our region in terms of building alliances that become more reliable if America is not so reliable in the future?
Look, I think that's always a good option, and frankly...
But is it realistic in this moment?
Not realistic now. I think we have been doing this for 5-10 years already. We're always worried about how invested America is in our region, and we have been building our relationships with Japan, with India, with other partners, and South Korea, and we will continue to do that, and I think we should continue to do that. But all of the allies of the United States are effectively basing our security around the United States being here and US technology. So when I talk to my Japanese counterparts, sure, they're also wondering, you know, what's the longevity of the Trump administration's interest here? We're all making assessments. But frankly, in the next 5 or 10 years, those countries are still basing their defence capability development on that partnership with the United States. And unfortunately, we just don't have the industrial capability in this military space to completely replace what the alliance gives us. Even if we were to spend 5% of GDP on defence, we still couldn't replace what the United States gives.
Deb's called in from Canberra with an interesting and personal question, actually, for you this afternoon on this relationship. What's your son doing, and what's your question, Deb?
Oh, yes. Hello, Hamish, and thank you for the program. My son is a mechanical engineer with the Navy. He's currently in the US at the nuclear power training facility, learning the very skills that are meant to come back in a couple of years' time and maintain these submarines over in Perth. I'm just wondering what will happen to the Australians who are currently over there if this deal doesn't go ahead, and what will happen with what they're learning when they come back if the submarines we end up with don't have nuclear capability.
Malcolm, you want to jump in?
Well, Deb, I don't think you should be concerned about your son's work because the one part of the AUKUS deal that will definitely go ahead is Australia providing the United States Navy with a nuclear submarine base in Perth, which is we're building, and maintenance facilities so that they will be able to do, you know, basic sort of in-water maintenance in Perth of the kind that they currently do in Guam, which of course is uncomfortably close to China. So hence their interest in Perth. So that those maintenance roles will still be here, whether we ever get any nuclear-powered submarines of our own or not.
Across Australia, you're listening to ABC Radio and watching us on ABC News. We're talking about Australia's place in the world because that turns out to be one of the biggest issues on voters' minds at this election. There are some slightly different policy positions from the major parties as you go to cast your vote, and so if you do have a question for us on that, maybe the defence promises made by the Coalition or by Labor, the panel here can answer those questions. Hayley, in terms of China, our focus has really shifted to America since Trump's been elected. But do we need to be talking about that as well? It's not really been such a big issue during this election campaign.
Well, I think to Lavina's point before, domestic issues always dominate an election. But in the past, there has been some focus on how Australia treats China. Now, there's
Given how much is going on in the world, are you surprised how little our leaders have actually addressed the meat of these issues?
Not really, because I think elections are won on cost of living and people want to know personally what they're going to get from whichever party is elected. That's why foreign policy doesn't usually feature, is because usually it's bipartisan and defence policy is usually bipartisan. But there are distinct differences between the two parties on foreign policy, including on China. But I think what we need to remember, there's often this question about China being our biggest trading partner, but also our biggest security threat. The thing about that is that that is not unique in history. In previous times, you've seen, whether it was before World War I, you'd have Germany. Its closest trading partners were Britain and Russia. And then right before World War II, and when Australia joined, Australia was trading with Japan right up until December 1941 because trade was in both countries' interests. So the relationship we have with China needs to be carefully managed. They're a friend and a foe, I would say, because the trade with them is enormous. Like, I can't explain how enormous it is. It's a third of our two-way trade, a quarter of our exports. And you have sort of China up here at more than 200 billion in trade last year. And the next largest trade partner is Japan on 80 billion. So it's just a huge gap. I want to bring in our next caller because it's specifically on what you're talking about there. Tim is in Adelaide. What's your question, Tim?
Oh, yes, I might throw this one at Lavina. Look, can you explain Australia's oscillation between opportunism and paranoia in regard to Asia, Asia generally and China specifically? Could our ignorance of the 5,000 years of Asian history, sophisticated cultures, learning, philosophy, mean that we're incapable of crafting a truly independent, informed relationship with China?
Great question. Can you answer it?
Look, I think there's plenty of opportunism in our relationship. As Hayley mentioned, we get an enormous amount from China in terms of our export of raw materials that they need for their growth. What I would probably say, though, is one, China doesn't necessarily represent all of Asian civilizations. We could also learn a lot from the 1,000-year civilizations, the Jewish civilizations, the Indian. We could learn from our own Indigenous Australians and the 60,000-year civilization that we have here in this country. So I think we can learn from many cultures, but I would push back on this idea that it's all paranoia.
But there,
yes.
I mean, Tim makes the point about friend or foe. We seem to, one minute we're friends with China, another minute they're our foe.
We have to be really clear-eyed about this. This is something that I think Peter Dutton said explicitly in the debate. Albanese refused to say that China is our major security threat. It is the most disruptive and the most threatening country in our region. We probably have got used to the kinds of coercive and intermediary kind of behaviour that they have in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the rehearsing for an invasion or a blockade of Taiwan. We had live fire training exercises, military exercises in the Tasman Sea and a circumnavigation of Australia, and somehow this hasn't really penetrated our election debate. So we can do both things. We can trade with China, but also be very clear-eyed about which country is the threat.
That point.
Yeah.
Malcolm earlier drew the distinction between capability and intention. That's really important. I used to be the deputy head of the Defence Department. My main job was to be the defence planner. We never sat down and looked at China in a binary sense to say, well, because we trade with them, we're not going to be preparing military options in relation to contingencies. You've got to do both because capability is long-term, as Malcolm said. Intention goes on a dime. The US and Japan, the record clearly shows it wasn't clear that there was going to be a military clash till about July or August of 41. Why? Because Roosevelt decided to embargo and sanction Imperial Japan, not after they went into China, but after they went into Indochina. And he put very heavy sanctions on their ability to use their currency to purchase resources, and then they made a decision. World War II, in the Pacific at least, might have taken a very different turn had that embargo decision not been taken. Not to say that Roosevelt caused the war, but that happened in a matter of weeks. Mm-hmm. If you were sitting there in July of 1940, as Menzies was, you might not necessarily have assumed that there was going to be a Pacific War, and that was a line ball calculation. You still, though, if I can just finish the point very quickly, Curtin had it right in the 37 election. He said whether or not there's going to be a war, we have to prepare. And guess what? Curtin went for defence self-reliance, submarines, long-range surface vessels and airfields across the north. Does that sound familiar?
So how do you make that argument to the Australian public, whether it's voting now or in future elections?
I think you've got to say...
Without turning up what the threat level is? Because obviously some people are not really convinced that the threat is there.
I get that, Hamish, but you've got to say it in those terms. Capability takes a long time to turn around. Intentions can change immediately. To Malcolm's earlier point about President Xi and Vietnam, I think we would want to take that very seriously because I don't think he's given to flippant rhetorical remarks. So whether Trump is talking about Canada, Greenland and Panama, maybe in the rhetorical bucket, I don't know, Malcolm, but for China to say we're going into Vietnam or we're going to threaten Vietnam, that would be injurious to the stability and the peace of the Pacific and Asia.
But isn't the distinction that we should be drawing between the United States, even now under Trump, and China, is that China is doing some things that are a bit like that, for example, in Hong Kong, maybe in other parts of Southeast Asia, without overtly stating this is our intention.
Or the Philippines, just the other day, they occupied a cay in the Spratly Islands that the Philippines also claim. They're doing real things that are worrying. Trump is full of the bluster about Canada and the rest of it. Does anyone seriously think he's going to launch a military operation against Canada?
Well, who knows?
Well, maybe if you're the Canadian Prime Minister, you might need to think about that. But I think with China, you're just seeing this progressive two-track approach. Build capability and then start to sharpen your intentions. I'll finish on this point. Bill Burns, who's not given former director of the CIA under Biden, not given to flourishing loose statements. He stated in February 23 on the open record, you can Google this tonight, that the CIA knew, and this is an unusual thing for a CIA director to say, as a matter of intelligence, that's in his Q&A at Georgetown University, that they had intelligence that she had directed the PLA to be ready, don't go ahead, but to be ready to invade and to occupy Taiwan in 2027.
1300 222 702 is the number. Jonathan in Melbourne's got a question on this topic. What is it, Jonathan?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking my question. As a middle power in the region, does Australia have an opportunity to bridge the gap between China and the United States?
Bridge the gap, Malcolm Turnbull. Could we be that? I mean, there was a time we talked about that a lot.
Yeah, we talked about that. Look, the Americans... I think at times we have done that, made a contribution to that. I think we have the Americans appreciate we have a different perspective on China. You know, we are much more of a multicultural society than the United States. You know, we have, Chinese Australians or Australians of Chinese heritage represent a much larger percentage of Australia than they do, their counterparts in the United States. And I think we've got a good understanding of our region. So I don't buy the proposition that we're disconnected and alienated from the region. I agree with Lavina. I think we've got a pretty good handle on it. The problem, the Americans, on the other hand, they are a superpower. China respects power. China, Chinese Communist Party believes might is right, so they're on the same wavelength as Donald Trump. And so the Americans and the Chinese used to have very good channels. But what's happened in China is, under Xi Jinping, is the system has become much more disciplined, much more controlled, and there are much fewer back channels nowadays. And so there isn't nearly enough talking going on between the United States and China, for example. And that's, the problem is when they're not talking, there's the risk of misunderstandings. And of course, Trump, we are at a point where, let's be frank, because of Trump's unilateral decisions on these tariffs, trade could almost come to a stop between the United States and China. And the consequences of that, as Hayley was saying at ABC a little while ago, would be massive damage to the global economy. It would hurt. The issue for us with Trump's tariffs is not the 10% he's put on our exports. The issue for us is what it does to the whole global economy and in general, and China in particular. So, the problem with Trump is, and again, look, I apologise, I'm not a theorist. I actually know the man, and I've talked to him about trade. So I apologise for actually knowing what I'm talking about. Trump has very deeply held views about trade, and he believes, and I've been through this with him and with Shinzo Abe, he believes that if you've got a trade deficit, you're a loser, and if you've got a trade surplus, you're a winner. And so he honestly does not understand trade. But he's had these views since the 1980s, and he's surrounded by people who share his views. And I think they will continue with this tariff agenda until such time as it absolutely manifestly results in real economic hardship. And then you hope, that mugged by reality, that he might change, but it'd be a massive climb down.
Do you think we can play any function in the US-China relationship, Lavina, or do we just actually, as a middle power, just sit and watch from the sidelines and hope we don't get hurt?
I think what we're all trying to do is understand why he's doing it. So I think the long-held views that he's had about trade deficits, I completely agree with that. But I think what we also have to understand is that the United States, under Trump, realised, and Biden realised this too, is that they've lost their industrial capacity. And that affects us too, as allies of the United States, because if there ever was a conflict, they too need to have the industrial capacity, the war machine, to actually have ammunition and to produce all of these submarines and ships and all the rest of it. So from one perspective, we can understand why they're doing that. And it is of benefit for us to see them re-industrialise. Yet we can also acknowledge the negative effects for us.
How do you get there?
How do you get there? And the damage that's done in between. But I just want to go back a little bit to what Mike's point was about capability and intention with China. I think one of the problems for us is simply my own analysis. If you look at President Xi and his China dream, he has an objective. I think the intentions are clear. I don't think the intentions are fuzzy. The intentions are very clear. He has territorial ambitions for the South China Sea, the East China Sea, to break through the first island chain and to dominate this region. So we have to be... I don't think we can change that.
So you think Mike's underestimating
No,
intention?
I don't think so.
I don't often get accused of that. But can I agree? The intention piece is about sequencing.
Yeah.
It's about his tactical decision-making about, do I rumble the Philippines first? Do I push up against Vietnam?
Do I test?
Do I test?
Well, I don't think he will push up against Vietnam, by the way. I was just giving that as an example. I mean, we seem to have this idea that Trump is but we've got to stop treating Donald Trump as a joke, right? I mean, when he says he wants Canada to be the 51st state, I tell you, the Canadians took it very seriously. And we're all kind of joking about it here. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not joking about it.
But to the extent of military action?
Well, massive economic coercion.
Sure.
I mean, economic coercion is just, if you can cause economic hardship to a country kinetically by blowing up its railways and factories and so forth, or you can impose sanctions on them such that they basically go broke and have to come to terms.
It's important, though, that we don't get trapped into this cycle for the next 4 years of debating how realistic everything Donald Trump says is, because we could get stuck in those black holes forever. And we really need to think about what he's actually doing rather than all of the things he says, because we could just get stuck in this spiral for 4 years.
Or what we should do. And can I just make this point, Hamish? I think, getting back to the caller earlier, look, you're not going to replace the strength of the alliance with the United States, and we should seek to remain allies with the United States, and we should seek to maintain that alliance. I mean, the risk, no one's talking about Australia walking away from the alliance. The risk is the Americans.
Is them abandoning us.
Is abandoning, right? Well, not abandoning us, but I mean, being less reliable, and certainly that's how the Europeans feel. I think we need to do a bunch of things at once. So just like we need a plan A and a plan B, and be prepared to execute both, we need to build stronger ties in the region. Lavina's absolutely right. We have been doing that, but we need to do more of it. And on trade, in particular, we haven't talked about trade, we really need to ramp up the collaboration between the countries, which will include China, that actually do not want to disrupt the global free trade or, trade order, rules-based trading order. I mean, Trump is the big disruptor there.
I want to take another caller. In 7 minutes from now, you get your latest news bulletin on radio and on television across Australia, wherever you're watching or listening. The number's 1300 222 702. And Blair from Newcastle has called in. What's your question and who's it to?
Thank you, Hamish. I have a question to the panel, and that is, could there be future problems for Australian trade by us hitching ourselves to a one-term ageing American president?
Donald Trump, I guess you're talking about. Hayley, he may, finish the term and leave. He does occasionally talk about running in 2028.
It's impossible, let me tell you. You would need a 2/3 majority of both houses, and then you would need 3/4 of all states to agree on it. It's not happening. You heard it here first.
Look, the guy's creative in his approach to democracy. I think we all can observe that. What's your answer to that question, though? Because, we are reliant on the trade. We may get a deal, we may not get a deal. Clearly, the arrangements we have are better than most other countries.
Oh, definitely. Look, Australia's starting from a strong base. We've got a free trade agreement. We've got a deficit. We also have massive foreign direct investment. The US is the largest source of our FDI, above and beyond many countries. But the point of the question is true. Donald Trump is putting disturbing the entire trade order. I'd push back on Malcolm and say that I think China has also been doing that in terms of, stopping buying Australian exports and trying to economically coerce other countries. Yeah. But the bottom line is that Trump is using tariffs as a blunt instrument for everything from foreign policy to raising revenue to immigration. And Australia relies on free trade.
But what if things ratchet up between the United States and China and Trump suddenly says to us, we want you to stop selling iron ore, for example, to China?
Yeah, funny you should say that, because some of the discussions that we're having at the United States Study Centre is, look at what the United States has done on Chinese electric vehicles. The US is going to ban Chinese EVs, and Australians love our BYD and other Chinese EVs. Even our very senior officials drive BYDs. What would happen if the United States said to Australia, stop buying Chinese goods? Now, I think at that point, the Australian government would make a decision in our national interests, and we would ignore the United States and focus on our national interests. We've done it before, we'd do it again.
I think that's right. Yeah. Can I just jump in on that point? Because I think there's a schism in American thinking about this, and I don't even know that Trump himself has decided. Do you go down what I call the Navarro route, so Pete Navarro, his principal advisor, which is tariffs forever, very high levels, very high walls, constant revenue stream. He's talked about $6 trillion over 10 years. To achieve that, everything has to go back to America, including things like Nike shoes out of Vietnam. Or do you go with the Treasury Secretary's model, which is actually quite different, where you have a shock and awe campaign, including on the penguins in Heard Island, and then you start to do deals not just about American dealing, but to ensure that there's no re-export threat. So Chinese exports re-exported through Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico, where you have to put in parallel or what they call supplementary barriers. We saw that a little bit with the 5G decision that the Turnbull government had to grapple with when Malcolm was Prime Minister. We could see, forget about the tariffs, we could see a massive global shock and awe campaign in terms of what effectively is either de-risking links with China or in fact some decoupling. We say actually to Vietnam, look, we'll knock the tariffs back down, you do the shoes because Nike's got plant machinery, but gosh, those Boeing planes are really good. And as part of our relationship, we think you should dial down your trading relationship with China. There's going to be a lot of decisions made, not just in Australia, all around the world. Effectively, it's a deindustrialisation strategy that they're pushing onto China. One quick data point, if I may. China's got about, in nominal GDP terms, 20% of global GDP. They're currently running at about 35% of global manufacturing. The American administration, whether you're Navarro in the White House or the Treasury Secretary, do not think that's sustainable because that gives them a war machine that is unbeatable.
We are running out of time. Whoever's Prime Minister next week, and could take a bit longer if there's a hung parliament, is the first job really to go and visit Trump? Is that what you've got to do?
Well, historically, Australian Prime Ministers have really gone to Indonesia. They've gone to Jakarta.
Bill Dutton said that's not what he'd do.
Oh, yeah?
that he'd talk to Trump first.
Well, usually the phone call is with the President of the United States, but the first visit is usually to Indonesia. Although Prime Minister Albanese went to Japan first this time, I actually think that would be a sensible decision again. But if it's a continued Labor government, then it wouldn't be a first visit. But yeah, it's important signalling, who your Prime Minister calls and which country they visit.
Yep. Well, a huge thanks to our panel for joining us for this hour. It's run away from us very quickly. Malcolm Turnbull, Hayley Channer, Dr. Lavina Lee, and to Mike Pezzulo as well. Thank you, all of you. Keep the conversation going after the news on ABC Radio across the country, if that's where you're listening. In case you missed part of this, you can catch up on iView. You can also see the other forums on housing and Australia's energy future. Thank you so much for your company. I'm Hamish Mcdonald from ABC Radio and from ABC News. Thank you, and happy voting. Enjoy your democracy sausage. See you later.